On the morning of June 10, 1816, a 22-year-old Connecticut clockmaker named Chauncey Jerome walked out of his shop in Plymouth to help a neighbor plant corn. He was wearing a wool overcoat, thick woolen mittens, and a wool cap pulled down over his ears. There was ice on the puddles in the road and snow on the north side of the stone walls. The thermometer on the shop door read 34 degrees. It was the middle of June in southern New England. Jerome described the morning in an autobiography he published 44 years later. The corn they planted never came up, and almost none of the corn planted in Litchfield County that year came to anything worth harvesting. Jerome's account is one of several hundred that survived from what New Englanders at the time were already calling the year without a summer. The cold had started in May. The first week of May 1816 was normal across Vermont and New Hampshire and western Massachusetts, which meant daytime temperatures in the 60s and nights above freezing, and buds opening on the apple trees. The second week was the same. On the night of May 14th, a hard frost came through northern New England and killed everything that had budded out. Farmers replanted. On the night of June 5th, after a warm afternoon that had felt like an ordinary spring day, the wind shifted to the northwest and the temperature fell 30 degrees in 6 hours. June 6th opened with snow falling across Vermont, New Hampshire, and the hill towns of western Massachusetts and eastern New York. The snow was not a dusting. In Vermont, the town of Cabot reported 6 inches on the ground by midday. In Danville, birds fell frozen out of the air. In Williamstown, Vermont, sheep that had been shorn for summer were found dead in the pastures. The storm lasted 3 days. It killed the second crop of gardens and the leaves on the maple trees and the lambs that had been born in late April. A farmer in Bennington, Vermont, named Benjamin Harwood, kept a daily diary that is now held at the Bennington Museum. His entries for June of 1816 are short. On June 6th, he wrote that the ground was covered with snow and that he had driven the cattle into the barn. June 7th recorded that the snow was still on the ground and the thermometer was at 24 degrees. June 8th, he found 3 lambs dead beside their mother in the upper pasture. June 9th, he planted corn for the second time that spring. 1 month later, on July 9th, his diary notes that the corn had come up and that another frost had killed it. On August 21st, a third frost killed what had been replanted after the July one. Harwood did not plant corn a 4th time. He wrote on September 12th that he had nothing to feed the cattle through the winter. The summer of 1816 was cold across the entire northeastern United States and most of Canada and most of Western Europe. The average summer temperature in New England that year was about 4 degrees Fahrenheit below the long-term average, which does not sound like much until the arithmetic is done. 4 degrees of summer cooling is enough to move the frost-free growing season of northern New England from 120 days to about 60. Corn and wheat and oats cannot mature in 60 days. Hay cannot be cut and cured from grass that is still in its first growth in August. The cold in 1816 was not a matter of farmers being uncomfortable. It was a matter of the harvest not existing. Sarah Snell Bryant lived in Cummington in the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts with her husband Peter and their 7 children, one of whom was an 11-year-old boy named William Cullen Bryant, who would later become the most famous poet in the country. Sarah kept a diary. For June 6th, she wrote a single line stating that it had snowed all day and that she had been obliged to keep a fire in the kitchen to prevent the children from taking cold. On June 7th, the snow was still falling. By August 13th, there was frost on the garden and the cucumber vines were dead. On September 27th, the corn was cut for fodder because it would not ripen. Peter Bryant was a country doctor and had to be paid in grain or potatoes or labor by farmers who had no cash. In the winter of 1816 to 1817, the Bryant family received almost no payments of any kind. Sarah recorded what they ate. It was mostly salted pork and potatoes and bread made from a mixture of wheat flour and ground peas, because wheat was scarce and expensive. Nobody in New England in June of 1816 knew why the weather had turned. There were theories. Some newspapers blamed sunspots. A popular pamphlet argued that it was divine judgment on the country for the sins of the War of 1812. A minister in Woodstock, Vermont, preached that the cold was a sign that the world was ending, and his congregation took the sermon seriously enough that several families stopped working their fields and waited for the end. A few educated observers in Boston and New Haven noticed that the sunsets had been unusually red and hazy all through the previous autumn, and a few noticed that the moon was dimmer than it should have been, but nobody connected the red sunsets or the dim moon to the cold. The connection would not be made for almost a century. Thomas Jefferson was farming at Monticello in Virginia that summer and complaining about the cold in his letters. He had been out of the presidency for 7 years and was experimenting with new varieties of corn and wheat and tobacco on the plantation. His account books for 1816 show the corn yield at about a third of what he had expected, which for him meant a cash shortfall of several $100s and forced him to borrow against next year's harvest to cover his household expenses. He wrote to a friend in September that the summer had been the coldest he had ever experienced in Virginia and that he did not know what to make of it. The growing season at Monticello was long enough that the cold did not destroy his crops completely, the way it was destroying crops in Vermont, but it thinned them badly and gave him his first direct experience of the food shortage that was by then visible in the market prices. The cause of the cold summer of 1816 was a volcano on the other side of the planet. Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia had erupted in April of 1815. The eruption was the largest in recorded human history. It ejected approximately 36 cubic miles of rock and ash and gas, and it sent a plume of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that spread around the globe in the upper atmosphere over the following 12 months. In the stratosphere, the sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to form a layer of sulfate aerosol particles that reflected sunlight back into space. The aerosol layer reduced the amount of solar energy reaching the ground by about 0.5%. That was enough to drop average temperatures across the northern hemisphere by 1 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, with larger drops in northern latitudes and in places already close to their growing season margins. New England and Quebec and the Scottish Highlands and the Alpine valleys of Switzerland were all close to their margins. They all failed that summer. The effects of the aerosol layer on American weather in 1816 were not uniform. The southern states had cold nights and thin harvests, but did not see frost in July. The Middle States saw July frost in the hill country of Pennsylvania and western Virginia, but a normal summer in the coastal plain. New England and upstate New York and the Canadian Maritimes got the worst of it because they were already close to the edge of the temperate zone, and because the cold air masses that formed over Hudson Bay in 1816 moved south more often and with more force than in ordinary years. The pattern repeated itself in Europe at the same latitude. Ireland had a catastrophic potato failure that killed an estimated 60,000 people over the following 18 months. Switzerland had famine that emptied villages in the Alpine cantons. Yunnan province in southwestern China had a rice failure that killed thousands more. The global death toll from the cold year and its aftermath, as estimated by modern historians working from local records, was somewhere above 100,000 people. Most of the dying was not from cold itself, but from starvation and the diseases that follow starvation. The harvest of 1816 in New England came in at roughly a third of its normal level. Corn was almost a total loss. Wheat was harvested in some southern Connecticut towns, but was thin and undersized elsewhere. Hay was catastrophic. A farmer who normally put up 20 tons of hay for the winter was lucky to put up 5, and the 5 was often coarse and wet and of low feeding value. Cattle and sheep that had gone through the summer half-fed were going into winter with no reserve and with inadequate stored feed. Farmers did the arithmetic and started slaughtering livestock in September rather than in November, because November animals would be thinner than September animals, and because hay that fed an animal into November was hay that could not be used to feed a different animal in February. Prices moved the way prices move when supply collapses. Wheat in Boston in August of 1815 had sold for $1.50 a bushel. In August of 1816, it sold for $3. By February of 1817, it was at $3.50. Corn followed the same curve. Potatoes, which did slightly better than grain because they could be planted late and harvested before the first deep frost, became the main calorie source for tens of thousands of New England families through the winter of 1816 to 1817. Oats doubled in price. Hay tripled. A family that had been living close to the margin in 1815 was unable to make it through 1816 without going into debt or selling something or leaving. Families who could not move and could not feed themselves went hungry. The records of the town poor farms in Vermont and New Hampshire show a sudden jump in admissions in the winter of 1816 to 1817. Mostly elderly people and widows with small children. Town selectmen in hill towns wrote letters to the state legislatures asking for emergency grain. A few towns held subscription drives to buy flour from southern New England and Pennsylvania, where the harvest had been better, and distributed it to families whose stores were gone. The town of Norwich, Vermont, raised about $400 that winter to buy rye flour from Hartford, Connecticut, and gave it out by the pound to anyone who came to the meeting house on Thursday mornings. The records of the distribution list the names of the recipients and the weights of the flour. Some families are on the list every week from January through April. Others appear once in February, and then never again, because they had left. A great many of them left. The 1816 cold summer accelerated a migration out of northern New England that had already been trickling west for 20 years and turned it into a flood. Estimates compiled in the 1820s by state officials in Vermont suggests that between 10 and 15,000 Vermonters left the state permanently between the fall of 1816 and the spring of 1818. Most of them went west into New York State and then farther west into Ohio and the Indiana Territory and the Illinois Territory. They traveled in wagons and on foot, following the old military roads and the new turnpikes, carrying seed grain and iron tools and children and very little else. The Erie Canal, which was being dug that same year, had not yet opened. Most of the migration moved overland. Among the Vermont families who left in 1816 was a man named Joseph Smith, who was farming a rented piece of ground in Norwich, Vermont, with his wife Lucy and their 8 children. Smith had lost his wheat crop in the frost of June 1816 and his corn crop in the frost of August 1816, and his family had eaten through most of their reserves over the winter. In the spring of 1817, he moved his family west to Palmyra in western New York State, where land was cheaper and the growing season was 2 weeks longer. Smith's 4th child, who was 11 years old at the time of the move, would later become a figure of national importance for reasons unrelated to the weather. But the weather was what moved him and his family off the Vermont farm. Lucy Smith described the decision in a memoir she wrote in the 1840s. She said that after the 3rd successive crop failure, there was nothing left to stay for. Thousands of other families made the same calculation and left no memoir. Their migrations appear in the federal census returns for the northern states of the Old Northwest in 1820 and 1830 as a sudden bulge of New England surnames in counties that had been mostly empty in 1810. They also appear in the Vermont census returns as towns whose populations had fallen between 1810 and 1820. Granville, Vermont, lost almost a quarter of its people. Granby lost almost a third. Cabot held on, but did not grow for another decade. The migration out of New England in 1816 and 1817 shaped the population of the Midwest for the next half-century. The counties of northern Ohio that received the largest shares of displaced New Englanders, among them Geauga and Ashtabula and Lorraine, developed a Yankee character in their town government and their schools and their church organization that distinguished them from the counties settled by Virginians and Kentuckians to the south. The Connecticut Reserve, which had been opened to settlement in the 1790s and was still mostly empty in 1815, filled up in 5 years. Indiana gained roughly 30,000 new residents between 1816 and 1820, many of them from New England. Illinois became a state in 1818 in part because enough New Englanders had moved into its northern counties in the 2 years after the cold summer to push its population above the territorial threshold. A single bad growing season on a Vermont hillside had, through the decisions of thousands of individual families, moved the political center of the country slightly to the west. Chauncey Jerome, the young clockmaker in Plymouth, Connecticut, did not leave. He wrote in his autobiography that the cold summer of 1816 was the hardest year of his life, and that he was often hungry and was wearing mittens indoors in August, but that Connecticut was less affected than Vermont, and that he was able to keep his job at the clockmaker's shop and eat enough to stay alive. He went on to build a business making inexpensive brass clocks that sold in the hundreds of thousands in the 1830s and 1840s, and made him for a few years one of the wealthier men in Connecticut. When he sat down in 1859 to write the story of his life, he was 76 years old and had outlived 2 wives and most of his children and his business, which had failed in 1855. And he had lived through the panics of 1837 and 1857, and the death of Andrew Jackson and the arrival of the railroad. And he had seen the telegraph and the steamboat and the daguerreotype. The year he kept coming back to in the book was 1816. He said it was the coldest summer he ever saw in his life, and that he had planted corn in mittens, and that the corn never came up. The Tambora eruption itself was not identified as the source of the 1816 cold until the 1920s, when a climatologist named William Jackson Humphreys, working at the United States Weather Bureau, compared dated ice cores from Greenland with historical weather records and noticed that the coldest summer in the Northern Hemisphere record lined up with the largest volcanic sulfate spike in the ice. Humphreys published his finding in a scientific paper in 1920 and argued that volcanoes had a measurable effect on global climate. Most of his contemporaries accepted the argument. The generation of New Englanders who had actually lived through 1816 was by then mostly dead, and none of them ever learned that the mittens Chauncey Jerome wore to plant corn on June 10, 1816, had been put on his hands by a mountain on the other side of the planet that had blown its top apart 14 months earlier. The sulfate aerosol layer from Mount Tambora dissipated from the stratosphere over the course of about 3 years. By the summer of 1819, the climate of New England was back to normal. The growing season was 120 days again. Corn ripened in September. Hay came in by the ton. The farmers who had stayed recovered. The farmers who had left were by then working different soil in Ohio and Indiana, soil that had never been frosted in June in living memory, and they were raising corn crops that made the Vermont crops of their childhood look small. They did not go back. The hill towns they had left behind never fully refilled. Tourists who drive through the back roads of Vermont today and see stone walls running through mature forest are looking at the boundary lines of farms that were cleared in the 1790s and abandoned by the 1820s, and many of those abandonments trace back to decisions made in the kitchen of a small frame house in the winter of 1816, when a man and a woman sat at a table and counted their remaining potatoes and talked quietly so the children sleeping in the loft would not hear. If you want more stories like this one, the full playlist is right here.